The massive galactic council chambers shook like they were caught in an earthquake. High Archivist Vexithara, a being made of what looked like living crystal, pressed her strange finger-like appendages against an ancient book called the Primordial Codex. This wasn't just any old book. It was older than anyone could remember, older than any civilization that still existed. The book glowed with a weak, dying light as she began to read the final words that had been written millions of years ago. "The youngest shall rise when all others fall." Her voice boomed through the enormous chamber, bouncing off walls that stretched, higher than skyscrapers. In the hour of the final convergence, those who walk between creation and destruction shall determine the fate of all. Commander G1 sat perfectly still in her chair. She represented Earth and all of humanity in this council of alien species. Her dark eyes stayed focused on the strange writing that covered the ancient pages. All around her, creatures from 12 different worlds whispered to each other in languages that sounded like music, clicks, growls, and sounds no human throat could make. But you didn't need to understand their words to feel their fear. It filled the air like smoke, the crystal being continued reading, but her voice was getting weaker with each word. The prophecy speaks of adaptability beyond measure, of beings who turn enemies into allies, who find strength in unity rather than dominance. Minho, who sat right next to G1, leaned forward in his seat. He was a xenobiologist, which meant he studied alien life forms. He had spent years learning about different species across the galaxy, but this prophecy was unlike anything he had ever heard. "What else does it say about these chosen ones?" he asked. The archivist's crystalline form began to flicker like a broken light bulb. She was ancient, even by the standards of her long-lived species, and reading this prophecy was taking everything she had left. "They are the bridge builders, the hope bringers. They possess the rarest gift, the ability to see potential where others see only problems." As soon as she finished speaking, something terrible happened. Alarms started blaring throughout the council chambers. The sound was so loud and urgent that several of the alien representatives jumped from their seats. But these weren't just local alarms. Communication devices across the chamber lit up with emergency signals coming from every corner of the galaxy. G1 grabbed her communication device and saw message after message flooding in from the outer rim worlds, the planets and star systems. On the very edge of known space, for millions of years there had been strange structures on these worlds. They looked like buildings or machines, but they had been completely silent and motionless for so long that most people had forgotten they were even there. Some scientists thought they were just weird rock formations. Others believed they were ruins left behind by some ancient civilization that had died out long ago. But now, after countless ages of silence, these structures were waking up. On the ice-covered world of Kepler 442b, massive metal towers that had been buried under glaciers for eons suddenly broke through the frozen surface. The ice cracked and shattered like glass as these enormous constructs rose into the sky. They were bigger than mountains, made of some kind of black metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Similar reports were coming in from 11 other worlds. Ancient machines were activating across the galaxy, all at the same time. It couldn't be a coincidence. Minho was frantically checking his datapad, comparing the locations of these awakening structures with star charts and historical records. His face went pale as he realized what he was looking at. "G1," he whispered. "These aren't random locations. They're positioned in a perfect geometric pattern across the galaxy." The other representatives in the council were panicking now. The proud Zephyrian ambassador, whose people controlled the largest military fleet in known space, was shouting orders into his communication device. The ethereal Melodians, who were known for their peaceful nature, were making sounds that could only be described as terrified singing. Even the logical Synthari, who prided themselves on never showing emotion, were displaying what could only be called concern. But G1 noticed something interesting. While all the other species were either panicking or preparing for war, the Adi humans in the chamber, herself, Minho, and the few other Earth representatives, were doing something different. They were thinking. They were analyzing. They were trying to understand what was happening instead of just reacting to it. Vexithara, who had been silent since finishing the prophecy, suddenly spoke again. Her voice was barely a whisper now. "The pattern matches," she said. "The awakening follows the same sequence described in the Codex. The final convergence has begun." As if her words had triggered something, the lights in the chamber dimmed. Outside the massive windows that looked out into space, they could see distant explosions lighting up the darkness. The first attacks had begun. The galaxy's youngest species, humanity, was about to face their greatest test. And according to an ancient prophecy written by beings who had vanished before humans had even learned to use fire, everything depended on what they would do next. The age of waiting was over. The age of proving themselves had begun. The thing that crawled out of the ice on Kepler 442b was like nothing anyone had ever seen before. Imagine a mountain made of black metal suddenly deciding to stand up and walk. That's what the first Harbinger construct looked like as it broke through miles of frozen ground that had covered it for millions of years. Its surface wasn't just black, it was obsidian so dark it seemed to swallow light itself. But worse than that, strange energy patterns danced across its surface like lightning trapped under glass. Just looking at these patterns made people's eyes water and their heads hurt. The construct didn't waste time. Within 6 hours of waking up, every single person on Kepler 442b was dead. 3 billion lives gone. The cities that had taken centuries to build were turned into perfect geometric patterns made of ash and dust. It wasn't random destruction. It was methodical, precise like someone erasing a drawing with careful strokes. Captain Sora stood on the bridge of her frigate, watching the reports come in from across the galaxy. Her hands gripped the metal railing so tightly that her knuckles had turned completely white. She was a veteran of 3 different wars, but she had never seen anything like this. 12 worlds in 3 days, she whispered to her first officer, Hayuk, who stood beside her looking equally stunned. Hayuk had been coordinating with the Galactic Defense Force, trying to understand what they were dealing with. What he learned made his stomach turn. The Galactic Defense Force lost 47 ships trying to stop just one of them, he reported, his voice shaking despite his efforts to stay calm. The constructs, they learn from every engagement. That was the truly terrifying part. These weren't just massive weapons, they were smart. Every time the galactic military tried a new tactic, the Harbinger constructs would adapt. Plasma cannons didn't work. The constructs developed shields. Missile swarms failed. They created point defense systems. Nuclear weapons had no effect. They absorbed the energy and used it to power themselves. Meanwhile, back on Earth, Minho hadn't slept in 72 hours. His office was covered with star charts, attack reports, and mathematical calculations. Empty coffee cups and food containers were scattered everywhere. His eyes were bloodshot, but he couldn't stop working. He knew there had to be a pattern. There was always a pattern. Finally, at 3 in the morning on his 4th day without sleep, he found it. The answer was so simple, it made him angry that he hadn't seen it sooner. He called an emergency meeting of what remained of the Galactic Council. Most of the representatives appeared as holograms now, since travel between worlds had become too dangerous. "They're not random," Minho announced, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. He pulled up a 3-dimensional map of the galaxy that showed the locations of all the attacks. "Look at this pattern. The Harbingers aren't just destroying worlds for fun. They're following a specific sequence, clearing a path toward the galactic core. The implications hit everyone at the same time. If these constructs were heading toward the center of the galaxy, they would pass through hundreds of heavily populated star systems. Billions more would die. But then something happened that changed everything. Captain Sora and her crew were patrolling near the Vega system when they detected a massive energy signature approaching. It was another Harbinger construct, this one even larger than the others. The thing was the size of a small moon, covered in the same reality-bending energy patterns that made it painful to look at. Standard protocol would have been to retreat immediately and call for backup. The Galactic Defense Force had already proven that direct confrontation was suicide, but Sora was human, and humans have a habit of thinking differently than everyone else. "Captain," Hyuk said nervously, "we should pull back. This thing will destroy us in seconds." Sora stared at the construct on her view screen. It was moving in a straight line toward the next populated system, completely ignoring her small frigate. That gave her an idea, a crazy, desperate, completely illogical idea that no military academy in the galaxy would have approved of. Hayuk, do we still have those mining charges we picked up at the asteroid belt? Yes, but Captain, those are for clearing debris, not fighting. I'm not planning to fight it, Sora interrupted. I'm planning to confuse it. What happened next had never been tried before in the history of galactic warfare. Instead of firing their weapons at the Harbinger construct, Sora ordered her crew to target the nearby asteroid field. They used their mining charges, explosives designed for breaking up rocks, not fighting wars, to collapse an entire section of asteroids. The debris cloud that resulted was massive and chaotic. Millions of rocks, ice chunks, and metal fragments suddenly filled the space between the Harbinger construct and its destination. The construct's sensors, which had been perfectly adapted to track enemy ships and incoming weapons, suddenly couldn't make sense of what they were seeing. For the first time since the ancient machines had awakened, something unprecedented happened. The Harbinger construct stopped moving. It sat there in space, its energy patterns flickering as it tried to process what had just occurred. Its programming told it to continue toward its target, but its sensors couldn't find a clear path through the debris field. The machine was confused. Back on Sora's bridge, the crew watched in amazement as the unstoppable force that had destroyed 12 worlds simply sat there, unable to decide what to do next. It's hesitating, Hayuk whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell. Sora smiled for the first time in days. Send a message to command, she said. Tell them we just figured out how to stop a Harbinger construct. We don't fight them like machines. We fight them like humans. The war was about to change completely. While the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy ran away and hid, humans did what they always do when faced with impossible odds. They got creative. The mighty Zephyrian Empire, with their massive fleets and fortress worlds that could withstand supernovas, pulled back behind their strongest defenses and sealed themselves off from the rest of the galaxy. The crystalline collective, beings of pure energy who had existed for millions of years, simply vanished behind impenetrable barriers. Even the ancient ethereal beings retreated to dimensions that the Harbinger constructs couldn't reach. Everyone was running except the humans. Engineer Doyun had set up his workshop in an abandoned space station near the front lines. While other species tried to understand Harbinger technology by studying it, analyzing it, and attempting to reverse engineer it, Doyun took a completely different approach. He didn't care how the technology worked. He just wanted to break. His workshop looked like a tornado had hit an electronics store. Pieces of destroyed Harbinger constructs were scattered everywhere, along with human tools, alien equipment and devices that had been jury-rigged together in ways that would make any engineer cry. Do-hyun hadn't slept properly in weeks, surviving. On coffee and pure stubbornness. Look at this, he said to his mixed team of human and alien engineers, holding up a piece of Harbinger circuitry. This component is designed to process 17 different types of energy signatures simultaneously. It's incredibly advanced, probably took millions of years to perfect. One of his alien colleagues, a logical synthari named Click Whistle Hum, examined the component. Yes, it is remarkably sophisticated. How do we counter such technology? Do-hyun grinned and pulled out a simple human device, a magnetic pulse generator that cost about 50 credits to build. We don't counter it. We confuse it. He activated the device, and the sophisticated Harbinger component immediately began sparking and smoking. See, this thing is so smart that when you feed it completely random, meaningless data, it tries to process it all. It gets stuck in an endless loop trying to make sense of nonsense. When he presented his findings to the Emergency Council of War, representatives from dozens of species listened in amazement. The council met on a heavily shielded space station that moved constantly to avoid detection. Around the table sat beings who had been enemies for centuries, now forced to work together for survival. They expect logical responses, Do-hyun explained, pointing to a holographic display showing Harbinger attack patterns. These machines have been programmed to deal with rational military tactics, but humans, were beautifully illogical. Meanwhile, Commander Jiwon was doing something that many thought was impossible. She was trying to convince natural enemies to work together. The Thornax were a warrior species who believed that strength came from constant conflict. They had been fighting the Melodians for over 3,000 years. The Melodians, on the other hand, were pacifists who believed violence was never the answer. Jiwon sat in a cramped meeting room with representatives from both species. The Thornax ambassador, whose name translated roughly to bone crusher of enemies, was literally growling at the Melodian representative, whose harmonious voice sounded like singing wind chimes. "How you ask us to fight alongside those who have refused to defend themselves for millennia?" Bone Crusher snarled, his forearms crossed in disgust. The Melodian representative, Harmony of Seven Moons, replied in their musical language, "Violence begets violence. We cannot compromise our principles." Jiwon had heard this same argument for hours. She stood up and slammed her hand on the table, making both aliens jump. "Principles won't matter when you're all dead," she said bluntly. "The Harbingers don't care about your 3,000-year war. They don't care about your philosophies. They're going to kill everyone equally. Survival trumps tradition." It took 3 more weeks of negotiations, but eventually something unprecedented happened. Thornax warriors began training alongside Melodian healers. The warriors learned that sometimes the best strategy was to avoid fighting altogether. The healers learned that sometimes violence was necessary to protect innocent lives. Captain Sora was leading the most dangerous missions of all, raids deep behind enemy lines. Her ship, the Incheon, had been modified so many times it barely looked like the original vessel. What made it special wasn't the modifications, though. It was the crew. Her bridge looked like a reunion of every species in the galaxy. Yuk, her human first officer, worked alongside Zara, a crystalline navigator whose body looked like living diamond. Their weapons officer was a reformed Thornax warrior who had learned human curse words and used them with enthusiasm. Their engineer was a Synthari who had started making irrational decisions and found that they worked better than logical ones. "Captain," Zara announced, her voice sounding like crystal bells, "we're approaching the Harbinger supply convoy." Sora studied the tactical display. According to every military manual in the galaxy, attacking a convoy protected by 3 Harbinger constructs was suicide. The logical approach would be to call for backup, plan a coordinated assault, and attack with overwhelming force. Instead, Sora ordered her crew to do something that made no tactical sense whatsoever. They approached the convoy while broadcasting old Earth music at maximum volume, painted their ship bright pink, and began flying in patterns that spelled out rude words in 17 different languages. The Harbinger constructs, programmed to expect military tactics, had no idea how to process this information. Were the humans attacking? Were they surrendering? Were they malfunctioning? While the ancient machines tried to figure out what was happening, Sora's crew slipped past their defenses and disabled the supply convoy using methods that no military academy would have approved of. Word of these victories spread quickly through the galaxy. Other species began paying attention to how humans fought. The proud Etherian navy, which had always relied on massive battleships and frontal assaults, started using hit-and-run tactics. They learned to retreat when retreat made no sense, to attack where enemies least expected it, and to use their enemies' expectations against them. The logical Synthari began making decisions based on intuition rather than calculation. They discovered that sometimes the wrong choice was actually the right one, simply because no one expected it. Even the peaceful Melodians learned to fight, but they fought in their own way. They used their natural harmony to create sounds that disrupted Harbinger communications. They turned their healing abilities into ways to repair damaged ships in the middle of battle. Across the galaxy, something amazing was happening. Species that had fought each other for millennia were learning to work together. Ancient enemies were becoming allies, and at the center of it all were humans, teaching everyone the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the best way to win is to change the rules of the game entirely. The galaxy was learning to fight like humans, and the Harbingers were starting to lose. The deep space monitoring stations at the edge of the galaxy had been watching empty void for decades. Their job was to scan the darkness between galaxies, looking for anything that might threaten civilized space. For years, they had seen nothing but cosmic dust and dying stars. Then, on a routine scan that started like any other day, something appeared that made every operator's blood run cold. 1,000 ships were emerging from the absolute darkness between galaxies. These weren't just big ships. Each one was the size of a moon. They moved in perfect formation through space that should have been empty, their surfaces covered with the same twisted geometric patterns that had appeared on the worlds destroyed by the Harbinger constructs. The patterns seemed to move and shift, even as you watched them, creating optical illusions that hurt to look at for too long. The monitoring station's emergency broadcasts reached every corner of the galaxy within hours. This was the architect, Fleet, the beings who had created the Harbinger constructs, returning after millions of years to see what had become of their experiment. Dr. Minho had barely left his research facility in months. Surrounded by stacks of ancient texts, computer analyses, and translation matrices, he had been working around the clock to decode the complete primordial codex. The prophecy that had started this whole crisis was just the beginning. There were thousands of pages of additional text that had been too damaged to read. Finally, after weeks of painstaking work, he cracked the code. What he discovered made him sit back in his chair, staring at the translation in disbelief. He immediately called an emergency meeting of every leader who could still communicate safely. The meeting took place in a shielded bunker deep underground on a neutral world. Representatives appeared as holograms from across the galaxy. Some from bunkers like this one, others from ships fleeing the advancing enemy fleet. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. It wasn't just a prophecy, Minho announced, his voice echoing in the silent chamber. The entire primordial codex. It was a test. The architects didn't just seed this galaxy with life randomly. They planted the seeds, then left detailed instructions to see which species would prove worthy of inheriting everything they had built. The implications hit everyone at once. Every species in the galaxy, every civilization that had ever risen and fallen, had been part of a massive experiment that had been running for millions of years. Look at the pattern, Minho continued, pulling up historical data that stretched back eons. Every previous dominant species failed the test. The Zephyrians became too focused on military conquest. The crystalline collective became too isolated and passive. The ethereal beings retreated from physical reality entirely. Species after species rose to power, and species after species failed because they went too far in one direction or another. Admiral Junho stood at the center of the largest war room in galactic history. Around him, holographic displays showed the positions of over 10,000 ships, the largest fleet that had ever been assembled. What made it truly remarkable wasn't its size, but its composition. Human vessels flew alongside Zephyrian battleships. Crystalline energy beings powered Thornax warrior craft. Melodian healers worked side by side with aggressive Synthari tactical computers. Every other species failed the test, Junho said, his voice carrying to representatives from dozens of worlds. They were either too aggressive or too passive, too logical or too emotional, too united or too divided. But humans, we're the balance they were looking for. It was true. Humans weren't the strongest species or the smartest or the most advanced, but they had something unique, the ability to bring out the best in others while learning from everyone they met. They could be fierce warriors when necessary, but also compassionate healers. They could make logical decisions but also trust their instincts. Most importantly, they could take natural enemies and turn them into trusted allies. The architect fleet moved through space with the inevitability of a cosmic force. They weren't hurrying. They had waited millions of years, and they could afford to take their time. Behind them, the Harbinger constructs that had terrorized the galaxy fell into perfect formation. Their job was nearly complete. They had cleared the path and tested the current inhabitants. Now their creators would determine the final outcome. As the massive fleet approached the galactic core, evacuation ships launched from hundreds of worlds. Families packed their most precious belongings and fled toward the outer rim, hoping to find safety in the empty regions of space. But everyone knew that if the architects decided the galaxy's current inhabitants had failed the test, there would be nowhere to run. Captain Sora now commanded a mixed fleet of 200 ships. Her original frigate had been joined by vessels from across the galaxy, all under her command, because she had proven that human tactics could work. Her fleet included former enemies who now trusted each other with their lives, species that had never worked together before learning to fight as one. She received her final orders through an encrypted channel. Hold them at the core. Give us time to evacuate the inner worlds. Standing on her bridge, Sora looked around at her crew. Hyuk, her human first officer, stood next to Zara, the crystalline navigator whose diamond-like form sparkled with inner light. Their weapons officer was Rage of Seven Suns, a Thornax warrior who had learned to value strategy over pure aggression. Their communications officer was a Melodian whose songs could coordinate fleet movements across light years of space. These beings had been enemies when this war started. Their species had fought each other for thousands of years. Now they worked together like they had been born to it. "Captain," Hyuk said quietly, "the evacuation ships won't make it out in time. The Architect fleet is moving faster than our projections." "Showed." Sora nodded. She had known this moment would come, the moment when someone would have to make the ultimate sacrifice to buy time for others. "Signal the fleet," she ordered. "All ships, prepare for final engagement." But then she paused, looking once more at her diverse crew. "We're not just buying time," she said quietly, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised even her. "We're proving that the galaxy chose correctly. We're showing the architects that their test worked, that it created something better than what came before." The final battle was about to begin, and with it, the ultimate test of whether the galaxy's youngest species truly deserved to inherit the stars. The battle of the galactic core was like nothing anyone had ever witnessed before. For 18 straight hours, the largest fleet in galactic history threw everything they had at the Architect ships. Plasma cannons that could melt asteroids barely scratched their surfaces. Nuclear weapons that could crack planets were absorbed and converted into energy. Even the most advanced weapons that the galaxy's combined civilizations could produce seemed useless against technology that was millions of years more advanced. The Architect fleet had expected to return to a galaxy that had been cleansed and prepared for their arrival. Instead, they found something that confused their ancient minds. Dozens of different species working together as one unified force. Ships that should have been enemies were protecting each other. Crews that spoke different languages were coordinating. Attacks with perfect precision. It was unprecedented in their millions of years of testing. Captain Sora watched the battle unfold from her command ship, seeing her fleet's attacks bounce harmlessly off the Architect vessels. Her mixed crew of humans and aliens had been fighting with courage and creativity, but conventional warfare wasn't working. The enemy's technology was simply too advanced. That's when Sora made a decision that would have been called insane by any military commander in galactic history. Instead of retreating or continuing the hopeless battle, she decided to do something that no one expected. She would board the enemy flagship and try to talk to them. "Captain, that's suicide," Hyuk protested when she announced her plan. "We don't even know if these beings can be reasoned with." "Maybe they can't," Sora replied, checking her equipment one last time. "But what if they can? What if they're just waiting to see what we'll do when everything else fails?" She assembled a boarding party that represented everything the galaxy had become during the war. Hyuk came with her, of course, her loyal first officer who had been by her side through every impossible mission. Minho joined them, bringing his vast knowledge of ancient cultures and languages. Dohyun packed his engineering tools, ready to adapt to whatever technology they might encounter. But most importantly, she brought representatives from a dozen different species, former enemies who had learned to trust each other completely. Getting aboard the Architect flagship required a level of creativity that only humans could have imagined. Instead of trying to blast through their defenses, Sora's team used the same chaotic tactics that had worked against the Harbinger constructs. They approached the massive ship while broadcasting a mixture of mathematical equations, music from 17 different worlds, and what appeared to be random static. The ship's defensive systems, programmed to handle military attacks, couldn't process this flood of apparently meaningless information. During the confusion, Sora's boarding shuttle slipped through a maintenance port that the ship's AI had momentarily forgotten to monitor. Inside the Architect flagship, everything was impossibly vast and alien. The corridors were wide enough to fly ships through, and the walls pulsed with the same geometric patterns that had marked the destroyed worlds. But instead of being hostile, the ship seemed almost curious about its unexpected visitors. They found the Architect in what appeared to be the ship's central chamber, a space so large that its ceiling disappeared into darkness above them. The being itself was like nothing they had ever seen. It stood 30 feet tall, its body made of what looked like living crystal that contained entire galaxies of swirling light. When it spoke, its voice sounded like the birth and death of stars. "Yuki, we're not meant to survive," the Architect said, its ancient voice echoing through the chamber. "The test was designed to eliminate the unworthy. Yet here you stand, having resisted forces that have cleansed 1,000 galaxies." Sora stepped forward, feeling incredibly small before this being that had shaped the history of countless worlds. But she didn't let that stop her from speaking her mind. "Maybe that's exactly why we passed your test," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "We don't just survive. We help others survive too." She gestured to her boarding party: humans, Thornax warriors, crystalline beings, Melodians, Synthari, and others who had learned to work together despite their differences. "You wanted to see which species could inherit the galaxy, but we're showing you that inheritance isn't about one species being better than all the others. It's about all of us working together, making each other stronger." The Architect was silent for a long moment, its crystalline form pulsing with what might have been thought or emotion. Around them, the ship's systems hummed with energy that had been accumulating for millions of years. "In all our testing," the being finally said, "across countless galaxies and eons of time, no species has ever offered partnership to their judges. They either cowered in fear or attacked with desperate fury. None ever sought to understand." Commander Jiwon, who had been listening carefully, stepped forward. "Then maybe you've been testing in the wrong places," she said with the confident smile that had convinced enemies to become allies throughout the war. "Humans don't just try to survive tests. We change the rules of the game entirely." The Architect's form suddenly brightened, filling the chamber with light that somehow felt warm instead of blinding. "Fascinating," it said, and for the first time, its voice carried something that sounded like wonder. "The test is complete. After millions of years of searching, the galaxy has chosen its inheritors, not through dominance or superiority, but through unity and cooperation." The ancient being began to change, its solid form becoming more ethereal. "The Architects withdraw from this galaxy. We will observe from afar to see what you build together. The greatest experiment in galactic history has succeeded beyond our wildest expectations." As quickly as they had appeared, the Architect fleet began to fade from normal space. The massive ships that had threatened to destroy everything simply vanished, returning to whatever dimension they had come from. The Harbinger constructs, their purpose fulfilled, powered down, and became silent monuments to a test that had finally been passed. Across the galaxy, celebration began, not the celebration of victory in war, but the celebration of a new beginning. Species that had been enemies for thousands of years were now permanent allies. Technologies that had been jealously guarded were freely shared. The galaxy had learned the most important lesson of all, that diversity was strength, and cooperation was more powerful than conquest. Humanity had not conquered the stars through superior technology or military might. Instead, they had done something far more remarkable. They had taught an entire galaxy how to hope, how to adapt, and how to work together toward a better future. The age of testing was over. The age of building had begun, and at the center of it all were the humans, not as rulers, but as the species that had shown everyone else that the greatest strength comes from helping others become the best versions of themselves. The galaxy would never be the same, and that was exactly as it should be.